bell up. If you cannot abide by it, please leave the room. And we have one note taker. We would like a backup note taker. Can somebody volunteer to do that, please? Please? While you're thinking about it, how about a jabber scribe? Can somebody do that for us? Sure. Thank you. Note taker backup, please. Somebody who's going to take notes anyway. Draw or move on. Okay.
So, Gene, feel free to ask people to clarify what they want captured.
All right. Over to you.
All right, this is our agenda for this afternoon. We have pretty much one draft we're going to be going through, certificates with John. I suspect that we've lost, quite a lot of spectators to other things that are happening in this slot. Anybody have any last-minute agenda bashes? John, if you could work your way up, I will start your slides.
Get to the pink box.
You feel free to.
Getting towards the end of the week's kind of nice, right? How many sessions we got left? Like 4, I think. Of course, bits and bytes tonight. Pretty nice, pretty mellow. I see that we have the devout here to help out with STIR. Hopefully, though, this is going to be pretty uneventful because I don't think we're going to say anything here that has not been architected now over the past few months as we've had interims and revisions to these documents to try to better understand how to align our work with a practical deployment strategy when it comes to certs. And I think based on discussions that Chris and I have had about the ongoing work in Addis on Shaken and our attempt to kind of figure out what the best aggregate is, I think we have a good kind of consensus story we can tell here for STIR certs today.
Ready?
Yep. So it's a new version. There wasn't last time. We thought we would go to the trouble of putting out something new. The main thing we really did in this, though, is that we divided the description of certificates in the draft into 2 basic approaches. And neither of these approaches are presented as being necessarily better than the other. I think they both have hard edges on them. There are advantages and disadvantages of both. In fact, they're presented in a way I'd say that is not entirely incompatible. And we can imagine a migration path that actually would allow these 2 approaches to ultimately merge going forward, and I'll talk a bit about that. But otherwise, I mean, there's very little different. Like a lot of the same core mechanisms that we had in the prior version of the draft are still there. And I think hopefully we're getting pretty close to done. There are a couple of outstanding issues we are going to need to talk about towards the end of this, but I think we're pretty close. Next slide. So these are the 2 approaches writ large. I mean, we know that we have this whole RFC 4474 BIS. We have the signing mechanism in the identity header that it defines. We know we have the passport object, which gives you what all the critical headers and claims are that we're going to use to prevent impersonation in these calls. Really now we're just looking at what the credentials are going to do that are going to sign those things. And that, to be clear, none of that signaling part is going to change based on what we do with these credentials. I mean, other than, what may appear in like the X5U field or something in Passport that actually identifies the cert itself. So we're talking here about ways to use certs that are either certs where the subject identifies the number holder. That's the first approach. And the second approach is where the certificate exists to identify the held numbers. And this is a very important distinction to grasp here. When we talk about, certificates, typically we think of them as having a subject, although for the web PKI case, which is the case we're all most familiar with, actually the subject most frequently appears in the subject alt name field of an X509 certificate. That's where the domain name will be that will actually be checked when you're making a decision about whether or not to trust the cert you've been passed down through TLS when you're connecting up to a website. But of course, there's all kinds of potential administrative or contact information that can appear in X509 beyond just a domain name like that. I use Comcast.net here as an example. Maybe it could be a telephone network specific identifier in some instances, like a SPID or an OCN. Those could in turn be encoded as domain names and in fact appear in the subject alt name field of the cert. Or they could be in some new certificate extension we defined. I think that's just syntax. I mean, the real semantic distinction of this approach is we're not going to talk about the numbers themselves in the cert at all. Held numbers are not a component of this in the first approach. It really just identifies the subject, which is either the network that it has or some surrogate identifier for the network like a SPID. And to be clear, a network might have many SPIDs, right? And so we would then have some certs that might have many SPIDs in them, or perhaps we would have SPID-specific certs. There are all kinds of ways to tune that to what operators might want to do with it. But at the high level, that's the first approach. The second approach is the one that we originally stressed in the STIR certs proposal, which is one where we really downplay identifying the subject as such and are more focused on the certificate being a way for you to ascertain what the set is of held numbers that are associated with the cert. And there are a couple of different certificate extensions that might carry this either by reference or by value within the cert, and there are various trade-offs associated with that. But the big property it gives you is that the cert really doesn't even need to have a clear subject. And this is a requirement that we discussed early on in STIR that led us down this path because there was a lot of concern about potentially leaking, I wouldn't say private information, but proprietary information perhaps about companies by revealing that in certs themselves. Do people here get the distinction that we're drawing? Anybody seeing this doesn't understand what the two approaches are that we're documenting in this now? I see people nodding their heads. People, if you care, do you get this? If you don't care, you don't have to nod your head, I promise. I mean, it'll have a subject, right? I mean, in the sense of there are X509 fields and so on, but that subject is not actually there to identify the carrier, ostensibly. And I'll talk actually about ways, of course, you could migrate from the first to the second. You could take a cert that has a clear subject like that and then add to it whatever these extensions are that help you to identify the held numbers. Yes, Mr. Barnes.
Yeah, I would phrase these two approaches as, specifying number ownership directly versus indirectly. The second option speaks directly to authority to speak for a number. In the first case, there's some implicit claim of the number by, signing a passport object or something like that. The binding is
right.
less obvious, less easy to verify.
Yeah, I mean, again, so we'll go through the advantages and disadvantages of these two approaches. And yes, it is dead simple if you have a number in the cert when you're just looking at passport to be able to figure out should the cert have signed it. Without that, some kind of lookup is required. Yes.
So, I mean, this seems like perfectly reasonable taxonomy, but maybe you can help clarify something for me. It looks like the 10 authorization list includes SPIDs, right? So
yes,
I guess.
So that was one way we were, right. So in the way that we initially defined the semantics, we were going to accommodate that to start with, right? In the second approach. Right. So it's kind of just a syntactic leftover. Okay. Second approach. So the other thing to do, though, you can imagine just as easily having a domain name that is like, 1535.spid.nanpa.com. Yeah. Right. And like having the SPID just be encoded in the subject alt name that way.
Well, I guess that was sort of my point. Was it seems like all the referenced one. It seems like anything that exists to reference a list should be list. Let's say list of numbers should be in one place, and things that are just pointers to identities should be in another place. But I wouldn't try to merge them. Okay. I think the conceptual. That's what I mean.
Right. For anyone listening remote and couldn't figure it out, that was Eric Riscola at the mic. Before him was Richard Barnes.
Yeah, it's really hard. I don't know what it is about the acoustics in it for me to hear people that are at the mics.
I couldn't understand Richard at all.
Yeah, I mean it's really difficult. Anyway, So I think people get it. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk a bit about what some of the advantages and disadvantages of the few approaches are. This, of course, just exists to remind everyone here who might not be following STIR super closely what the basic architecture is. Some kind of logical authority is going to be provisioning these credentials down probably into things like intermediaries. Intermediaries are going to be doing the signing of requests. We call this the authentication service function of STIR. Typically done in an intermediary, though we also show an example here where it's done in like a PBX endpoint. You could imagine an IP PBX doing it. But at the end of the day, the logical authority at the top is what's responsible for making sure you get the credentials. This is unchanged, I think, between the two approaches. There's going to be some kind of authority that's doling out certs for this, and it may be that it looks a lot like a traditional web authority if we're just operating on traditional DNS names, right? But nothing about the way that we do the actual signatures and identity headers and things like that is going to be substantially altered by this. Yes.
Sorry, more question. Do you, I see you suggest there's the ability to have a reference rather than a, rather than entity itself. Is your notion, is that purely for compression or is it also for flexibility?
I think so there are a couple of strategies, and I think we have a slide about this that we use for by reference. One of them is much more like an interrogation system where you just say, for this particular certificate, is this number within its scope?
Right.
And obviously that has different semantics for preserving proprietary information than saying, could you please tell me all of the telephone numbers that are,
right,
within the scope of authority of the certificate.
Right.
And it's a trade-off. And I think there are actually implementation environments. I can imagine forking big, right, services that might want to subscribe to a
right
list like that so that they can build a local database. And so I don't want to rule that out.
Right. I guess so the concern I'm attempting to get at is the referential integrity of the information, namely that that one impact of putting the data directly implied in the certificate is that it's covered by the signature, not covered by some HTTPS reference. And so if the property you're attempting to obtain is merely that you only want to see some of the records, as opposed to that you want to have the flexibility to change it later, then it's probably worth considering if we're attempting to tie the integrity all the way down to the signature rather than tying it to a reference that is then not sub-resource protected.
Yeah, and let's revisit that
in
connection with what OCSP might be for a protocol that helps us with this versus just having a generic web service. Some of this information, things like, is this telephone number under the scope of this OCN, is actually information that a number of services that you might have your own trust relationship can provide to you. Whereas again, OCSP has a slightly different, this is now you're trusting.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
So we go into this a bit, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Forward, and you can tell me if we get it right.
Yeah, of course. I'll draw back on.
Okay, next slide, please. Right, so the first approach goes through how verifiers validate calls when the cert only identifies the carrier or has a surrogate ID like an OCN or a SPIT. Now, the very simple and extremely deployable way to do this is if we have major networks that have bilateral trust relationships that are doing these signings, if I may just pick out two friends of mine in the room, I see Martin Daly and I see Chris Wendt, maybe like AT&T and Comcast have established this bilateral business relationship and trust relationship, and they agree they're just going to trust numbers that are signed by each other. And you could imagine a consortium even that might grow that to a certain size that is based on those kinds of bilateral trust relationships. And that is the simplest way to do this, because you just get to use the certs that tell you Comcast.net is the subject of this. And if you trust Comcast.net, then you trust who's signing it on the other side of it. The advantage is very deployable. The disadvantage is it's not very inclusive. And the inclusivity of this is, I think, the part of it that we try to address when we talk about the possibility of having some kind of an external service. But Richard, you seem to want to speak to the first
Well, as much as I love inclusivity, there's a scalability issue here as well.
There is also a scalability issue, ultimately. Given that there are, say, in the United States, around 3,000 local exchange carriers, there are, I think it's 95% of all numbers are done by the top 12 or something. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's quite a bit, and there's very long tail.
Okay, so Martin Daly, I think you could start out with something like this. If you look at the long pole in the tent on this, and something that hasn't been addressed yet is what's going to be displayed to the end user. And so if we look at this from a deployment perspective, stage deployments, getting, the big 7, 8 to deploy the signing first and exchanging it this way while working on, with respect to the, exchanging of the certs and whatnot, to detect that, to have that capability in at a later date, which then coincides with the delivery to the end user in some consistent manner, which is outside the scope of this work, that this has been verified, so on and so forth, I think is a workable, deployment type scenario.
All right, so I have a migration path slide that I think will make you very happy that you will see in 10 minutes or so here. But it's important to be very clear, that UX component of this, we're not in the business here of the IETF of telling you as an operator who you trust or why, right? And nor are we in the business of designing the UX that is going to surface for this night. I understand there are some other bodies that are studying this UX problem. I'm very interested in seeing that done in a standard way that will be clear about what level of assurance and so on is being provided by this. And I would be happy to provide any input or support, any hooks that are needed to make sure that we get that right for them. But it is incumbent, I think, on the people that are doing that side of the work to let us know if there's anything we need to do differently to get there here. Because we're not going to do that stuff here ourselves. Yes, Chris, sorry.
Chris Wine, I was just going to point out, I'm hoping this is more simplistic than what the first approach is, purely based on trust. I'm hoping that there's certificate infrastructure there that we can rely on cryptographic trust, not just, are you implying here like we just self-sign certificates and AT&T trusts Comcast, so therefore...
No, I wasn't implying that. I was implying you have your normal web cert for Comcast.net, and you're just using that to sign this. And
yeah, okay.
So that, again, the first approach is based on this whole notion that what you're attesting in the certificate, and the reason why you trust the certificate is because of who that entity is, right?
Yeah.
And the way that you express who that entity is, we have a couple options, but the simplest of those is just to take whatever credentials you use today to attest that you are Comcast.net and to use those.
Okay. Well, our assumption is that there is some trusted authority that does a root signature of your certificates, and there's more than just trust there, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but let me know if you'd like me to do that for you guys. But we don't make this decision here in the IETF, right, about what the CA would be.
I'm just pointing out what the goal is. I mean, there's the practical thing of, when is that available and what chicken or egg scenarios where one is available than the other. But I mean, the big thing to work on is getting the protocol in place and the end-to-end calls happening. And
we do, but I think
if certificates become before that, then we can do something more complex.
I think it's important that we document, though, what we think the range of plausible certificate usages are, what we think is a transitional strategy that's getting us towards where we want to go and where we want to end up as we do that. And yes, what the start looks like, I think could look very much like what you just described.
Chris, you and Richard both, I know you like to speak softly, but given the way this microphone is working, please go ahead and project, go into public speaking voice mode.
Yeah, it is like really hard for me to hear you, but so far I'm doing okay. But yes, one thing I want to stress about this approach is that anytime you have a carrier who perhaps is not part of those bilateral trust relationships, one alternative that I would put on the table immediately is that some kind of oracle could probably help you with this. If they have an identifier like an OCN or a SPID, something that can just be thrown out to an external data service and inquired, okay, I don't know much about this person. Is it likely that this number that this call is from, is actually under their authority? And there are a bunch of different ways that you could do that. This doesn't have to be a golden route. This just, this can just be done. I think a variety of competing services could provide this as a function, or the certificate itself, if the CA was structured that way, could bless a particular one that was trusted for your network. And I don't think we're gonna make decisions about which of those is right. What we're gonna do again is provide protocol machinery here that is gonna support those options. And so as we go through this in deployment environment, we'll see what works, we'll see what's useful. I'd rather kind of get all the moving pieces I think we might need specified now, and then we'll see what gets used. And we can then pare this down, and then the work that's being done in Addis and elsewhere can really, once we get this into the test beds, once we get this into operational production, can tell us a lot more about what worked and what didn't. Next, please. So, right, the second approach, and this is the approach that originally the STIR certs draft was most focused on, is this notion that a verifier validates a call when the authority over numbers is actually built into the cert itself. The purpose of having a cert is for the cert to tell you what numbers are in its scope. And there are a bunch of different ways to do this. The most obvious of them would be like there is this TN off list certificate extension, which is specified now in the STIR certs document. If it has one number in it, and you compare that one number to the one number that was being called in the from header field of the p-asserted identity header, and they don't match, then you have a verification problem. It's dead simple. That is the advantage. There's no RTTs, there's no messing around. The enormous disadvantage of this, however, is that some kind of a new CA system is needed to provide these certs. And dealing with large heterogeneous block numbers is extremely problematic because of porting and pooling and all the other things we know so well in the numbering space. Mr. York.
New York, channeling Eric Berger. Does that work? All right, I don't need to be that loud. So, Eric Berger, with more hair, says, please, second approach simply will not work in the US. Numbers are regularly, and for good reasons, listed as the caller ID that do not have anything to do with the carrier. So, a legitimate call under the second approach will be rejected. Approach 2 is DOA, at least in North America, and probably in most jurisdictions. The issue also kills the oracle function John mentioned related to the first approach. The most we can do is trust the vouching carrier. I will also pause and note that somebody left an iPad here.
It's mine, yes.
Oh, okay.
My water, too. Yeah, so Mr. Berger, that's a very, very strong assertion. And I think I would need to much better understand the motivation for that assertion. Because it's simply not my understanding that is the situation. There is no if that is true, Mr. Berger, then like iMessage is illegal, obviously. So would you care to explain why we are not arresting Tim Cook for that, among other offenses at this point?
We're going to use the red button.
Okay. Does audio work?
Go ahead, Eric.
There we are.
Yes.
Hi there. So the reason it's like that is you're a legitimate call center. You're doing outbound calls for a client. The number you have in there is their CenturyLink number. Your number is served by Verizon Wholesale. Verizon Wholesale does not own the CenturyLink numbers, not going to work. You put in your 800 number coming back. 800 number is carried by AT&T, but you're a CenturyLink customer. CenturyLink will not have those numbers, so they can't sign for it. The doctor who's got, using his cell phones, Verizon Wireless, and, his office is Comcast, it's not going to work.
I mean, I think you're aware, Eric, we have this whole delegation thing that's built into this too, right? And that you can delegate that way, and that's been a huge part of this from the start, right? That solves everything that you just said, and as we've been discussing for 3 years here, so. Unless
this was part of the
Right. It's
problem that we set out to solve. We've got an RFC that says we are solving that case, and I believe that the second approach does have mechanics to deal with that delegation.
I mean, to be clear, we have a prep model document. The prep model document is very explicit. I mean, I don't know if I have the slide in this one. There's a specific piece of text that says that what we are going to try to solve in this group is a way to ascertain whether or not the signature for these calls has the authority to sign for that particular number or not. And the suggestion that this is illegal or something in every municipality or impossible to realize is absolutely preposterous. It's just, I mean, send to the list what you think the laws is that I will be jailed for doing
Eric,
this.
maybe you can clarify. I don't think you were asserting that it would be illegal. I think you were asserting that it would not assert the identity of the number that had been delegated to the person to use. And that you were making a technical objection, not the legal framework would prevent it from being used.
He suggested the regulatory framework would prevent it from being used, was what he said the first time. Then he said a bunch of very different things the second time, but.
so it's Daniel, I guess Yeah, I mean, I remember being here in the early days, and I was in that same situation of saying, does, you know, for hosted application servers, et cetera, that are working on behalf of somebody like the doctor's office. I mean, we've been talking about that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Does that work under the second approach and what you've got here?
Of course.
Okay. I think that was what I took from Eric's message he was looking to say, to ensure that it would.
I'd say something else to you, Eric, and you know, this is, I wish you were here, because then we could have a tighter conversation about this. You know, when I got up at the microphone in your lurk bot there and said, you know, I have this working group called STIR, and there are like, you know, visiting networks and home networks, and I can like totally imagine key proxying systems that would be, you know, I mean, I was being facetious, but like if that's if you want to point to like IMS architectures and say that those are the things that make this problematic, yeah, there are ways to address secure delegation, secure redirection, and even lurk-like approaches to that. So it just suggests it's like technically impossible, or that it's like, you know, against regulation, I think is just FUD. Unless, if it's not FUD, show me why it's not.
Chris went. So the middle ground I like to play here is that we do need some mechanism to protect law enforcement, IRS, school district, those types of numbers. We should look to this as a way forward for that, and then see where we go from there.
Yeah, so there are specific use cases for which this seems like having that specific number attestation actually kind of useful. It's not every use case, and it may not be the main like carrier signing use cases that are motivating the considerations in ATIS today, but precisely things that you're talking about. If so much of impersonation, say around this time of year, comes from specific spoofed numbers that are associated with the IRS, for example, in North America, and this is like a seasonal problem that comes up around tax season and is responsible for a lot of scams, tactically protecting particular sets of numbers may turn out to be quite meaningful for solutions like this. Ecker, do you have something more to say about that?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the problem with the protecting the numbers. So, I mean, obviously, any situation where you get the cert and then you do the fetch has less than ideal privacy properties. So
we can make it, you know, a real binary, simple, you know, is this number within the scope of authority for the cert, yes or no? Which is better than other things we talked about for this, right? So,
sorry, better than what?
Than dumping the entire list of numbers that are associated with the cert.
Well, yes. Well, it's better, yes and no. It's better for the person making the call to worse for the person receiving the call.
Yes.
So I guess I'd like to get back to understanding the motivations for the particular design we're looking at here, in terms of there certainly are designs which would allow you to attest to, which would allow you to have a small certificate, only reveal one of the entries in it, and yet not require a database dip, right? So, for instance, on a Merkle hash tree with bit commitments for the values. So, I'm not saying there's ideal designs. I understand there are those designs exist. So, what are the constraints that we're trying to optimize for?
I mean, and to be clear, when people started getting terrified about the direction of the STIR certs draft was when, Barnes, you may need to go back to the dunce position in the back of the room again. When we were talking about stapling, right? I mean, if you already do this with OCSP, like you could do stapling, which obviously does invert that privacy consideration. And I can imagine doing a SIP header that is a staple for this, right?
Sure.
Do you think that techniques like that are?
And that seems viable. I mean, I guess that generally is not clear to me how OCSP stapling is. OCSP stapling looks a lot like shortlist certs, right?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Right, and so I mean, so I mean, and the bottom line is you need to I mean, in fact, in this particular case, if I have an OCSP stapled response, I might as well have the cert. And so the typical reason to have, the typical reason to have the, you might imagine having, so I think if you're given a cert that has a testimonial for a large block, and then that you can't read. And then it says, please call here to find out if this particular certificate is valid. Like, then, and you say, invert that, and you say, well, the OCSP response you would have gotten, is the one that basically is a testimonial for a single entry in the block, and it's attached to the cert. You could have just dispensed with the cert and had only the OCSP stable response, or a shortlist cert that corresponded to the OCSP stable response.
I guess the position has been, we are very interested in making sure we have an optimization that will preserve the privacy properties we're talking about. We have not decided on one yet, right? It could be the shortlist certs is a more viable option for us, frankly, than doing with OCSP. I think we can get away with saying we're punting on that to get this initial thing out the door to help get us on the migration path. Like, I don't think I'm saying, if you see something you think we're saying here that is going to prevent us from going down short-lived certs, for example, as a path, we should find that. And
no, I don't. I guess this is a very flexible mechanism you designed with a lot of possible options. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, are all those options useful, or could we cover the use cases with a smaller set of options? I don't disagree with you. I think this would certainly enable us to do. This would definitely enable us to do short-lived certs. It would not enable us, I believe, to do. It would not enable us to do something like hash trees, where you where you subsequently reveal pieces of it, unless you. Here's like a concrete example of design you could imagine with a hash tree, right? You say, like, basically, I give you I've been assigned a huge block, and I get a signature that covers that entire block, and that's a signature on the root of the hash tree. And then I know all my entries, and then what I give you as an end entity, because you're allowed to use one phone number, is I give you the copy of my cert plus the chain up the hash tree for only you, and then you can attest to this one entity, but I don't have to do a delegation down to you, and I also don't have to do so I guess my point is, this wouldn't support that, because you need a new data structure. I guess so. I think if we think shortlist certs are enough, then probably it's fine. If we think the use case requires something more sophisticated, then perhaps we're not quite there yet. But I think absolutely this would allow you to do shortlist certs.
Chris, I think this is less about arguing about whether the technology is appropriate. It's more about, sorry, I'll get right in there. It's more about how do we get from A to B. And a lot of the thought has been, making sure that the verification services support both approaches as much as possible from the beginning. So as the infrastructure evolves, we can move from A to B, but we want to make sure we don't break things in between.
And we're real flexible, to Ecker's point, on exactly what the verification service chooses to do with these certs. And when we get to the migration path, which I think is like the next slide after this, then we'll talk a bit more about that.
So I just wanted to correct one thing on this slide. The disadvantage and the first sub-bullet says that a new CA is needed. And if these are done with a meaningful subject and some extension that encodes the numbers you're allocated, that's perfectly compatible with using existing WebPKI certs. It's just a different extension that the CA puts in.
Yeah, it's more the question of what the enrollment, it's the CSP. It's actually like what CPS that actually I think they don't have for this to get enrollment you would need for it.
Sure, but I mean, CAs change their CPSs to emit new extensions all the time. It's a pretty low lift.
Yeah, I've just, again.
For instance, we just added the must staple extension. We expect to be fairly broadly used without a major revamp of the PKI.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
Dan York channeling Eric Berger. First, just note that he was not talking about law or regulation previously. His comment is that it's worth noting the delegation mechanism in the draft, which is in section 4.0, is TBD. There's one section saying there might be delegation, and then in 4.0, and then there's two parts to it that are TBD, saying future versions of spec may do this. His suggestions is, how about a concrete proposal? Break the draft into two or more certificate approaches. Why bundle them together? Approach 1 works today. Approach 2 may work if and when fleshed out. Then he also says, I don't want to tell the FCC we are late with STIR because we are working on an approach that may not be used.
I don't want to tell the FCC that we are, delivering something that doesn't actually solve their problem. And something that doesn't actually solve what's in the problem statement, that you can figure out how to get whether for the subject if the number is in the scope of it or not, is what we said we were going to solve. And I understand that, you know, again, can we go to like next slide, I think? Next slide, the migration path.
This next one after this, do you
Yeah.
want to go straight to that one?
Yeah, go straight to that one, actually. You know, I mean, I look at this a lot like I think I look at how DKIM got started, right? I mean, what I want to see is a number of large providers who are willing to start signing these things in this first approach way, right? And that, you know, because with DKIM, when Google and Yahoo and whatever the set of other, you know, initial proponents were, did it, like suddenly like 40% of email was being DKIM signed. And that was just very useful to get this off the ground because, let's face it, a lot of mail comes from Gmail and comes from Yahoo and things like that. Very similar case here. A lot of mail comes from AT&T and comes from Comcast, and I think a lot of people will trust their assignations because that's where it came from. Good. And then we can stand up these support services, right? And the certificates can either, again, through a variety of approaches we've discussed, have surrogate identifiers that you will then query some, you know, public oracles that could, again, may not even be connected to the certificate authority in any way to answer questions like, is this number under this FIT, right? It could be that there are independent entities you trust for your own reasons. You could have your own offline database, right, that sitting right there next to your verifier that has big maps of that for you. If you're one of the larger providers, that's not at all an implausible scenario. And so, you know, I'd like to think that we're not going to be late if we are providing a migration path that shows, here's how you start, here's some directions that we can show going forward from here. What I don't want to do, though, is end up in a situation where verifiers implement one little subset of this that only works for the first step in this, because what that will lead to is a not very inclusive environment going forward where something completely new and different will have to be done to support anybody other than that gang of 8 or whatever it is from participating. I think that is unacceptable as a migration story, and that is why, at least Eric, my argument has been that we need these to be in the same draft.
So let me see if I can recap what I think you just said, because they taught me in, like, you know, framing. So you're saying initially we're going to have a situation where basically I look at this and go, this is from AT&T. I don't care what the number is. That seems totally cromulent, right? And then, but you would like the system to implement validation mechanisms which could support a more rich set of delegation procedures, so that when we have someone other than just AT&T, I can actually go, oh, this appears to be from, you know, the Podunk City, you know, phone company, and it's just the Podunk City phone block, so it's cool. But if it were some 800 number somewhere else, it would not be cool. Is that correct?
Yes.
I can believe in that story.
And again, I don't think it's going to delay this going forward to do this. And in fact, I think it's essential that we do something like this, and if we're going to say with a straight face that we're solving the problem.
Okay, so Martin Daly. I mean, I think the first approach, you know, particularly if you have some representation like an OCN in the cert, can go beyond the gang of 7, 8.
It can. Yeah.
But I agree with Chris as well that there are use cases where the second approach is also very useful. So I think, you know, supporting both, you know, and recognizing a migratory path is good pragmatically, and I think we can get consensus around that, which is probably more important.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope we can get consensus around that. Mr. Berger.
Dan York channeling Eric. Eric says, so if the approach is to put out something that works for 90+% of traffic and then with experience will work for everybody, why toss out something that we may learn from experience may or may not work? We might even learn the right way to do it.
So an argument I've made before that I'll make again now is that if the gang of 8 people that we hope to seed adoption for this were the source of the calls that are problematic that we're actually being asked to address, then you know, it would be a great solution to the robocalling and voicemail hacking and everything else problems to just get them to do it. However, as we know, it's actually primarily, at least in the United States, a number of much smaller entities, right, that are the source of the problematic calls. And as a consequence, again, I look at it much more like it is, you know, seeding adoption from the major providers gives us that bootstrap, gives us that implementation base, and will handle some of the problematic cases, right? But it's really a lot of these unfortunately, I think these smaller providers that if we don't have a story to how to get them into this, they're actually where the problem is coming from, right?
So, Dan York, speaking in my own hat, it sounds like, as I sit and listen to this and read this, I guess it sounds like you and Eric are in violent agreement on one part of things, which is that approach number one should be deployed sooner rather than later.
It can be, yeah. And
Okay.
so I'm offering, the IETF is not going to cause this migration path to happen because this migration path is not a part of a standard we're going to produce. This
Right.
migration path is a vision for how the components, the protocol mechanisms we're discussing could be deployed and make a difference in the world. What we propose to do, again, is to put forward a standard that is going to contain the necessary machinery to create this migration path in the industry.
So if I could, the summary I see then is that you both agree that the first approach could work. The difference is that Eric wants to stop with approach one, or just get that out there and ship it, basically get that started.
Right.
Whereas you want to ship something that includes that approach, but also includes another approach that could be used by others.
Yeah, for the very specific reason I just gave, that
Sure.
I don't believe it is the people that are in that community of good doers that are responsible for the actual problem.
Okay.
Right? And that's why I think just shipping that doesn't actually address the problem.
And Eric has just said in there, yes, I want to stop with approach one for now, need to learn more before doing approach two. The important point is for now, not forever. So he's of the approach of ship it now, get it out, do this, see what it does, and then figure out if approach two is needed. Is that a fair?
I think you're fairly characterizing what he says, and yes, I fundamentally disagree. I think
Okay.
I think that would be a mistake.
Chris Wen, I don't want to extend things too much further, but I haven't seen anything or advocated for anything that doesn't allow the smaller carriers or the pink carriers or whoever to get a certificate. I mean, those are the guys that'll probably resist this the most, right?
Yep.
It's in our favor to have less, spam on our voice networks. So I'm not sure why we need to bring up Gang of Eight or anything like that, other than the fact that maybe we can push this forward.
That is the point of Gang of Eight
Yeah.
getting in it. is to
So
get
I'd rather have that positive perspective rather than the.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And look, you're doing the Lord's work over there now, so I do. I appreciate it. I'm not trying to say otherwise.
At moments like this, it can sometimes be useful to consult our working group charter when we're deciding whether or not we're heading in the right direction.
Remember to project.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the charter here. It says we will develop a solution, a mechanism for verification that the originator of a SIP session is authorized to use the claim source telephone number. And as that reads to me, the mechanism one here doesn't meet the mail for that. If you're verifying some non-telephone number identity of the originator, that's great. That can be used with some out-of-band stuff to verify the telephone number authorization, but it's not a solution to verify the telephone number. So I think before we can call this working group's work complete, we need something that actually solves the remainder of that problem. So, yes, we can do one as a bridging step, but we ultimately need to get to two.
And I just don't see the point in cracking this into like two deliverables. Because all that will do is encourage people to do the thing that isn't going to help. Right? Well, it helps, right? It helps seed adoption. It helps get some signatures right. I'm not saying it doesn't help at all, but it will encourage people to do something that is not sufficient to actually address, I think, what our core threat model is, and have an opportunity and an excuse to stop there in a place that, again, I feel is insufficiently inclusive. Russ.
Russ Housley, speaking with no hats. Approach one builds on widely available today technology and lets us get going. Approach two requires the inclusion in that infrastructure of some new extensions, and possibly, like in the OCSP case, for enhancements of some of the infrastructure services. So I think we need to work on those, learn about them, and if we need to do a V2 of the second approach after we get those lessons, that's fine. But let's not wait. and not learn those lessons early.
I mean, I don't want to speak too much about what our implementation is like, but we're building this stuff, right? So the stuff can be built, I promise.
Eric Berger, I do agree with Richard Barnes. And if the threat model is pink carriers, approach 1 works.
Yeah, okay. Well, so no, I mean, so let me try to explain why I think what he means by that. Insofar as, you know, pink carriers are attempting to impersonate numbers that are used by Gang of 8 people, provided there is an expectation among the members of that trust domain that they're going to have these signatures in there, then yes, that impersonator is not going to be able to impersonate one of those Gang of 8 numbers. However, as we all know, the source of these impersonation things, Henning actually has a great graph of this, I'm sure you've seen, Eric, of what the rural Washington telcos are that are being used as the primary, you know, robocalling sources, right? And like, I think the optics of this are entirely different than you think. So for like voicemail hacking, I agree. The Gang of 8 approach to this isn't a bad one, because it will prevent someone from being able to impersonate you to call your own mailbox if you are an AT&T customer, say. And that is useful. The robocalling one, I think not so much.
Eric Berger again, he agrees with Russ. Publish approach 1, work on, and then publish approach 2.
Okay, so you guys are just in back and forth mode between the two of you now. It would help me to get a sense of the room. I can see faces, but let's go ahead and get a hum so we can lay down what the current thinking in the room is. If you think we should go down the path that John is proposing, what the current document does after it's fleshed out, of specifying both of these approaches at the same time in our initial release, I'll ask you to hum in a second. The second hum will be split the doc into do one and then do the other.
I have a channel from a relay from Ken Karlberg, who says, could we push approach 2 to an appendix to get a current snapshot and continue approach 2 in another document?
That's a hybrid,
Okay.
So let's start with the hums that I just proposed. If you think that we should go ahead and finish out the documenting of both of these at once, hum now. If you think we should split things out, and I'll put it either into the appendix or a separate document for the first hum, hum now. Okay, so there were no hums in the room. I suspect there have to be at least one hum, 2 hums in Jabber.
2 hums in Jabber.
All right, so we've got a pretty strong majority in the room that we want to go ahead and run this thing out. Those of you that dissent, continue to argue your case on list, but let's move on.
Yeah, and please do, Eric. I mean, again, I don't want to trivialize this, right? I mean, we're trying to get something that's practically going to work. You know as well as any of us do what the constraints are that we're operating under on this in terms of the timelines and in terms of what the actual problem is. And we've studied this for a long time now, man. And I mean, I think we understand what is going to solve what of the things that we can do here. Next.
We have 10 minutes.
For me and.
We have 10 minutes left in the meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I just want to say this again. This is a crucial part of this, right? The IETF is not going to dictate verifier policy, and we acknowledge that, right? And even if we supply additional information within these certs that could be used to access some kind of off-board external service, you know, that is not going to compel your verifier that you are operating to consult those services if your trust relationships tell you to do something else. Because of that, again, I have a really hard time seeing what the harm is in specifying this protocol machinery and making this available, because at the end of the day, if what really people just want to do is just Gang of 8, then they don't even need to invoke this stuff, okay? It's like a couple extra bytes in your cert, and it's not even worth having this kind of a conflict over. Next. So if we think this migration path makes sense, let's get out the thumb screws. Okay, there may be a little more TBD-ish stuff to do in there, but I don't think there's a ton of like new protocol work. We got to fix the algorithm stuff actually that's being talked about in the list today, but we have delegated that responsibility to certain individuals that are participating in this process, and I expect that we will have some new text for that very soon. Once we have a 04, which I promise will fill in those TBDs on delegation, this is not rocket science for that. I think we should be done, right? If the one thing I'd say is we do want to have a non-OCSP service, like a web service that's something that converts OCNs to telephone number lists or lets you query for an OCN to say what the telephone number is. There, Eric, because that would be like totally new work. Totally, let's do that in another deliverable. Because that would be like a new web service redefining, and that I am happy to put somewhere else and say, let's do that later. I think we've got enough to do the basic building blocks in there today, and let's do that. I have one more slide that actually isn't about this. So before we go to that, I mean, people roughly cool here? People feel like we got this? We understand what's going on? Should we be worrying more about the privacy model before we go forward and not excluding some of the options like Ecker was describing? I mean, is there any real discomfiture that people have with this approach? If so, this would be a great time to talk about it.
No one's running to the mic.
Okay, so I got one more slide. It's a plug. There is this other working group, it's called Modern. And we're trying to provide kind of the overall ecosystem for how numbering might function on the internet. We could really use some other people to come and talk to us about it. We want to get like a bit more, a place where we get to good consensus calls for this. It's after this. If, unlike Martin Daly, you're not getting on a plane immediately, it'd be really great if you could make it to the Modern session next and talk to us about it. That's all I have.
Awesome. What's your current best guess for next set of revs? When should I expect to be finding thumbs to put in the screws?
Yeah, I mean, given how much interest there is in this work, and I think people here understand how much interest there is, I would suggest that we already start looking at scheduling an interim phone call, for 6 to 8 weeks out, and that we target revisions for that. Because this has just got to get done. I don't want us getting hate mail saying that we're slackers. So
late May, early June.
That'd be great.
Does anyone? Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, schedule the call. Don't just
Yep.
make it like John and Chris are gonna find the energy to do this on their own. Yeah.
We'll go ahead and
Schedule the call.
get that done in the next week or so. Any other business? Thank you. I think we've made really good progress this week. I appreciate everyone's diligence today.
And everyone go to Modern.
Take care. Thank you.
So I discovered you can buy by a bearing sea level.
Oh yeah.
From a bearing, yes. One of our peeps, bought another one of 50. Like go turn 50 pounds. It's like $50. It would just be Lord Peterson.
So
John Lord Lake Geneva.
Let's just talk later tonight about.
Yes. I have some ideas, but that's also not.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, honestly, I think about it. I mean, given your call basically came in from these dudes, probably not like a big deal, but if it's going somewhere else, it's a very deal.
I'm trying to get people to sign up to do that. Yes. So I've got some folks that are doing. I don't know exactly how I can characterize their products. Some folks that left Hamburg a while back that are building some pretty strong multi-party systems. I'm also talking to some endpoint, like software.